Just firstly, I want to welcome the Minister to the House, and secondly, just as I was listening to Pauline speak, it struck me that expression, blessed are those amongst women, because there are virtually no men in the chamber. Certainly, I'm the only male senator here, and certainly you're the Minister, and of course you, the Senator's Gahirla. But for some reason, I just clicked, and I thought about that. I think that's quite profound in itself. Minister, I want to firstly welcome you to the House, and I want to thank you for the enormous amount of work that you have done. You've travelled a journey too, like so many other people. I spoke earlier on when I talked about Dr. Muldoon, and I was welcomed his reappointment as the Children's Ombudsman. I talked about a past, I talked about now, and I talked about a future. And I really don't want to spend too much time talking about the past. What I can tell this House, I grew up in institutional care all of my life. I was born in the Dublin Union in St. Kevin's, which is now St. James's Hospital, and I wasn't adopted. So this report leaves many glaring holes, because we talk about mother and baby homes and children that were in homes and were adopted. But what about the children that weren't adopted? What about the children that were being prevented from being adopted? What about the people that fell out of the definition of family? And I want to touch on that particular issue later on. They went on, of course, as you well know, to be in full-time residential care. If there were horror stories in the mother and baby homes, there were even greater horror stories in the long-term care. I speak a man who's lived the experience, and quite frankly, I'm 59 years of age and I'll be 60 this coming May, and I really don't want to spend any more of my life talking about it. It does not define me. I am not a victim. I dare say I'm not even a survivor. I lived my life and I had many happy times. I enjoyed many happy times. I encountered many good and happy people, and I'm happy to say in institutions they were religious and they were lay, and I don't want them to be forgotten, because I think it is important it's heard out there. We're not all victims, and we had experiences. And I am the seventh of 7 children. And I'm in touch with every one of them. And we joked the other day how many families of 7 are in contact and speaking and are friendly and loving and supportive. And I too had the great honour and privilege of giving the eulogy at both my mother and my father's grave and funeral, and healing many wounds and misunderstandings with a community that rejected them and didn't stand with them. I am Church of Ireland by birth and heritage and by choice. So it wasn't always the Catholic Church, and it wasn't always the priest, and it wasn't always the nun. I think that's really, really important to say. But just to deal with the report briefly, it was limited in terms of its reference. That wasn't the judge or the Commission's response. If you look at the discussions and the minutes and the papers, you will know the politics of the terms of reference and why those terms of reference were so narrow. It was limited in the institutions it investigated. Didn't investigate the institution that I lived in, or the number of institutions I lived in owned by the same group. It was limited in its access information, and that was partly because many of it was destroyed, not all deliberately. Things move on, new personnel, new changes, new people responsible. So it was limited in that too. Many of its personal testimonies were never heard in public, and one of the glaring problems in this report is that people say they were denied their opportunity to public testament, to give public. There's a real innate need, primal in many ways, for us to tell our story. All of us. We all have unique stories here. None of us are unique. But there is a real need to tell our stories. And I think it's very important. Minister, I had a conversation with you on the telephone last week, and I want to thank you for that offer and that opportunity, and I took it up. And I think even I and you were conscious of how long everyone tells to tell their story, but that's just part of this process, and I think it's really important that we listen. So many people were traumatised. But I think some glaring lines I want to take out of the report. This report talks that there were women were admitted to these institutions at 12 years of age, from 12 to 40. Unaccompanied children were called fondlings. So many of these children were left at doors. I spoke to a man this very day whose mother he is now in touch with pressed a bell, left them in a little Moses basket and ran away. There's no history there, other than that's the story. What was really disturbing was also on page 41 of the report, it refers to Thomastown, and I presume that's Thomastown in County Kilkenny. There were 58 infants were sleeping in 32 cots. 58 infants in 32 cots. And also in the report, which I found really disturbing, was the issue of the sleeping arrangements were often inherently unsafe. And rather than misquote anybody, I think this is really shocking and harrowing and needs to be read into the record of this House. The Commission tell us the Commission has not heard direct evidence of abuse of children. Surprise, surprise, they said, I am, in county homes, but is aware that the sleeping arrangements were often inherently unsafe, particularly for boys, who often slept in adult ward and sometimes in the same bed as an adult. You don't tell me that's not abuse. You don't tell me that leaves children exposed to all sorts of problems. But that's the past. But it happened, and we need to acknowledge it, because that's really, really important. Pauline touched on councils, and I have made contact with many, many councils about this issue, and I know many of them are bringing it up. I'm elected by county councillors. I'm lucky. I'm very privileged, and I want to say here and put it on the record of the House, every day I come into this House, I'm exceptionally proud to be here. I want to be here. My experience in the past politicised me, with all its difficulties, with all its setbacks, with all its challenges, but it did. And I'm so happy that I can stand here as a member of the Oireachtas and have that privilege, that absolute honour and privilege to be one little voice, and in some way represent some of the people that grew up with me. And I keep in touch with many, many of them, so I think that's important, and I want to say that. But the reality is the committee interviewed and gathered sworn affidavits from 555 people during this investigation. The report spans from 1922 to 1998, and 14 mother and baby home representative examples. But there were loads of other institutions were left out. And there's a suggestion that there may be compensation, or may be redress or restitution to people. Minister, I ask you this. Anyone who was in care and was subject or should have been under some sort of supervision by the state must get redress if they haven't got it. Please, please allow people have redress regardless of being in. There are people and institutions that were excluded in this, and surely you're not going to give them or put them at any disadvantage. And will you please, Minister, whatever redress scheme you agree, don't issue gagging orders to people that they can't talk after it, because that's not fair, that's not right, and that's not proper too. And so these institutions, were told in this report, were 56,000 and 57,000 children, and we know that over 9,000 people died. It's shocking. It's terrible. It shouldn't have happened. And when you hear of people, they talk about not being heard and not listened. And there was a woman on RT radio on Sunday, and I don't know if you heard her, but she was very moving. She talked about, I am a woman of faith and continue to be of faith. And I saw somebody go away with a child in a box that I believed was mine. And all I want is that it be buried in consecrated ground. My heart is broken, she said, and I cannot shed any more tears. There's no more tears to give. So, Minister, I think it's important that we move on and that we have restitution and we deal with that. I want to touch on another issue, which is the Wellcome Foundation that carried out drug trials, of which I lived through and was subject to in the institution I was in. Micheál Martin, the Taoiseach, will be fully aware of it, because we engaged 20 years ago. I told this House some months ago we engaged on it. Very substantial records of engagement with him on it, and to be fair, he was supportive. But there was no justice and nothing done. And I want to say, particularly in the context of COVID, I'm not anti-vax. I will be queuing up to have a vaccination. I want to make that very clear, and there are two separate issues. But it is about accountability, and I would ask that the Wellcome Smith Kline Foundation, that they would be asked to make a substantial contribution to any redress scheme. I think that is important. It's important that people are heard. I want to thank particularly now the public service journalism that was at its best, who helped and stood in solidarity with me and so many others, be they television or journalists or the written or the typed. They stood and they shone a light on the story. And my final real thanks has to be to the brave women, and yes, there were some brave men who were denied access to their children too, and I know of some of them. But to thank the brave women for telling their story, for laying bare their vulnerability, so important to them, and for shining a light on their lives, but also shining a light on our shared history. Our response, Minister, now must be redress, support, enhanced pensions, enhanced opportunities for housing, and all that goes with all of that. And finally, our response, and I know no one here will be shy and shortcoming in this regard, our response and the government's response must be one of compassion, care and justice.